Hi, my name is Andrew Campbell, and I am a family violence prevention researcher and educator. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today on a topic that I truly feel is of critical importance in our field, always, but especially now, given some of the current circumstances related to the coronavirus COVID-19 response. As family violence victims serving professionals, we truly are finding really was essentially our worst nightmare, a situation where many of our resources in the community that we would typically use are shut down, and children may very likely be trapped in a state of self-quarantine in homes with perpetrators right now for an extended period of time. Now, I understand the response and the things that we're doing as necessary to slow this pandemic. I'm not at all saying they're not necessary. I just think we need to be aware of the potential risk that is increasing across the country and around the globe during this time and related to these measures. Even before all of this started, I really felt the importance of this topic, but even more so now. When we think about the field of family violence, we are often forgotten, often kind of marginalized. It feels like, unfortunately, much like the families we serve sometimes feel the same way that they are forgotten as well. We're usually working understaffed, under-resourced, and with all the odds stacked against us. But we owe it to these victims and to these families who are so worth it. They are so worth fighting for. We owe it to them to figure this out. I don't think the state of being under-resourced or undermanned is likely to change anytime soon. And so in terms of moving forward and progressing in this field, the only way I see that we can possibly do that is by learning to work with what we've got, learning to work better with each other. For long, we've long worked alongside each other. It's less often or less common that we work well together, and it really is time for that to change. And that's the message behind today's talk. I'm going to be sharing perspective, research from different fields that are involved in this battle against or to end domestic violence. And I want you to listen today and try to, even if it's just one thing you can take away, one perspective, one piece of information that sparks interest, that sparks ideas, and run with it. I would challenge you to find one discipline. I mean, even more is better, but at least one discipline that, as a result of information you hear today, you have some sort of, kind of light bulb moment where you can think or at least identify an area of potential improvement between your agencies, something that you two can work together at and get better at or be more effective at. I truly believe that is where real change will come in this field. When we as professionals check egos at the door, we set our differences aside and truly learn to work better together. And I hope you hear that today throughout this recording. As I said, my name is Andrew Campbell, and I'm the founder and CEO of Campbell Research and Consulting. I, a little over a year ago, decided to start my own organization to really allow me to dive deeper, further into these issues, particularly looking at the overlap of pet abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse. You can see Charlie and Mia pictured there, my two golden doodles. It had rained heavily the day before, and I had been given strict instructions, do not let them out of my sight. There was a giant mud puddle or mud pit in our backyard. I mean, I'd done pretty well. I'd done a pretty good job, but those last 30 seconds, I lost sight of them, and I still can hear my stepson when he said, "Andrew, you're dead." And I turned to find them sitting there like that, obviously very proud of themselves for finding that puddle. Pleased to say, obviously, I survived. These dogs do truly provide such joy in our lives, much as, or just as many other dogs, that I've had in my life as well. Pets are such critical components of our mental health, and I'll be speaking to that a lot today as we continue. I'm often asked, why domestic violence? Why this area of interest? Why focus your work in this area? A lot of it is personal interest from my own emotional harmony and experiences. In my youth and teenage years and early adult years, just being exposed to significant toxic stress and emotional harm. An early memory I have, one of the most vivid memories that actually still occurs in the form of nightmares sometimes, is waking up to my mom very upset and crying, My father's standing in the room, and he says something along the lines of look after your mom and sister. I'm leaving. I remember picking my mom up and saying, if you will not let him back in, I will take care of you guys. The thought, the hurt and pain of seeing someone you care about so deeply broken is something that I'm not sure that I'll ever fully recover from, just mentally and emotionally. Just to see someone you care that much about in that state. And I think when we talk about domestic violence, we often minimize the impact that it may have on children. But you can't do that. You cannot separate the well-being of a child from that of their caregiver. If you hurt one, you will significantly impact the other. Um, I understand we're limited on resources, but we sometimes, I feel like, try to look the other way or minimize its effect. But I find the opposite to be true. It is extremely impactful on children. Um, for me, again, at 13 or 14, I remember picking my mom up and saying, hey, if I'll take care of you. And I went out and got my first job soon after that, and worked 2 jobs or more most of the rest of the time for the next probably 13 years or so. That time was a period of extreme stress for me, very high stress, and significant emotional harm during that period, as well as physiological changes to my body. I know I have observable brain changes through MRI that I believe is completely explained through that toxic stress exposure, as well as conditions to my heart, and blood pressure and other aspects that I'm dealing with now, again related to that extreme toxic stress exposure. I can remember just feeling so overwhelmed, going to adults and saying, something's not right. I'm having headaches. I'm having stomach aches. Something's not right. And back then, just didn't really understand the science as well of what was going on. But we do now, and I do now, and I've gained a greater understanding of that. The thing that's often overwhelming for me to think about. So when we talk about toxic stress, we do sometimes recognize that it steals childhoods. It makes children grow up more quickly than they should. We forget that it cuts adult life short too, though. That now I'm looking at the very high potential of a shortened life, which means less moments like the one you see there with my son, that I literally wouldn't trade anything for. It just feels so unfair when we talk about children in homes that are impacted emotionally and psychologically to this extent. Um, and there are many who have it much worse than I did. I don't want to make that picture that I had it worse than there are many that have it so much worse. For me, it was all I could handle, though. And I think about losing precious moments like these, and it's just more than I can bear sometimes, and it's what drives my work. Honestly, this is what's helping me heal, by getting out there, sounding the alarm, and it drives the passion behind this message and behind my work. I also am very, or try to focus a lot on the critical role of pets, for good reason. Here you can see my son William with his babies, as he calls them. Always room for one more, according to him. I think he would have us cut off the roof of that car and drop one in, or airlift a few more in. Obviously something we're going to have to deal with before he turns 16 and starts driving real cars. I think there very well could be some safety concerns there. Here you see him planning what to do with the first snow of the year with his partners in crime, Charlie and Mia. And here you see me and Shelby. Shelby was the dog that got me through all of the pain and heartache and hurt. I remember 13, 14, 15 years old, sitting outside on the back, or out in the backyard, just completely overwhelmed. 3 a.m., 2 a.m., middle of the night, just feeling so overwhelmed. I tried so hard to hide the pain and the hurt. I was usually pretty outgoing. I tried to make people laugh and be sort of a class clown at school, and but I was hiding that hurt and that pain, and that dog was one of the few that I really let see it. And he never said a word, but was everything I needed. Some nights he would sit there and lick the tears from my eyes. Others he would sit on the edge of the yard as if saying, "I've got this. You're good. Take a minute." That dog I credit completely with getting me through. I don't know where I'd be if it weren't for him, but I certainly wouldn't be here now. I also have professional experience in working with a wide range of victim serving professionals. And I am also a former 2-time, or I guess lifetime, always, 2-time Kmart Employee of the Month. As you can see there with those watches, something obviously that I'm very proud of to this day. I have the harmonica there. I think at this time, now I'm a father of 3, then I was a father of 2. I think I had my 1-year-old was crying that I would play the harmonica, and my 13-year-old crying, "Please stop playing the harmonica." seemed like a difficult moment, and I think I had to go over to both watches at that time to hopefully help get me through. Another thought on Kmart. I know that obviously what we're dealing with right now with the pandemic and the response is extremely serious, but I can't help thinking that Kmart would have led the way. Now unfortunately there are very few of these stores around. As I said, I worked starting from a young age. I worked many jobs. I worked for a very long time at Kmart, one in Indiana, one in Virginia. But in our stores, they were often so underpopulated, it literally would have been nearly impossible not to social distance in our stores. As I said, I work closely with a lot of victim serving agencies, and everything you see, maybe not so much the Kmart parts, but everything else has really kind of helped me develop this unique perspective of violence in the home. And again, I credit that dog right there for getting me through, and I try to honor him in these talks. As I made the comments about Kmart, I'll try to add a couple slides in, or a couple things that are unrelated to the topic. There's not intended to be any further depth in them than to give you a mental break. So please take them. If you don't find them a mental break, if you don't enjoy them, I apologize. I guess then it's just even going to be a more difficult webinar to get through. But the whole purpose of the break slides that I've included are to give you a mental break. So I think in this talk, just because it's only an hour talk, I just have one grouping of a break. But please take that. The topics and things we're talking about are very heavy. So when you see that come up, take that mental break. Don't try to make it any deeper than it really is, and just allow yourself a quick second to take a break and then to come back to what we're talking about. So we'll kind of get into the topic and more of the conversation about the idea of developing a multidisciplinary perspective now. We know domestic violence is extremely prevalent. Many of us who work in this field do. Estimates are that it affects between 30 and 40% of families involved in the child welfare system. It can make up as many as 50% of law enforcement calls, depending on where you are in the country. Some of the East Coast police departments report that half of their police calls are related to family violence. I mean, just think about that for a minute. 50% of their calls. Again, it just boggles my mind why family violence is often swept under the rug, why it's often paid so little attention to. Something that affects, estimates of 1 in 4 women in their lifetime, and that's just women. It doesn't talk about, all the men that are impacted, all the children, pets. I mean, it just affects such a large proportion of the population. It still just blows my mind why it gets so seemingly a little attention compared to other topics and things in public health. I know it's not fun to talk about, but it's critical to talk about because it impacts so many other areas of health and life as well. And we know that up to 35%, so more than a third of all hospital ER visits, are attributable in some way to DV. Important to remember that adult victims may be more likely to be allowed to bring their children in than themselves. So pediatricians and those working with children, again, a critical opportunity often to detect domestic violence. Just oversimplifying domestic violence, we're looking at an accumulation of stressors, as you see kind of piling in around the individual there. I want to make it clear domestic violence can occur in any home. It can occur in homes where individuals are well employed, have a high income, have great education or high levels of education. It can happen anywhere. Risk factors are just what have been identified in research and in studies as occurring more frequently, at least in the reported cases. So I want to make that clarification. It can happen anywhere. But we do know these risk factors for domestic violence and abuse in the home. And then we also see other things and factors that can compound these risk factors: history of victimization, and drugs, alcohol. Again, think of the current circumstances of the quarantine response right now related to the coronavirus or COVID-19. And really, like I said, a worst nightmare for family violence professionals. We're thinking about all these risk factors being just brought to an extreme level right now. Unfortunately, we often see this inappropriate response to these stressors, often as an act of control. And again, thinking further, right now many individuals feeling they have little control over things, we may be even more likely to see these actions of control in the home, but reacting in either a way of intimate partner violence or violence against adults in the home or a partner in the home. We also see then this action of child abuse or pet abuse. Often we can see these two kind of tied together, and that's a separate talk I give about their interconnectedness, but we see that as well. So again, it's just this idea of all these stressors resulting in these abusive and violent actions by the perpetrator. As I said, right now we're dealing in really different times. Obviously, something that when I wrote this talk, I was not ready for any of this. I had to rewrite large portions of this talk. I always try to keep my research and my presentations current, up to date, up to the minute. So I had to make some changes to account for where we're at right now. As you can see there, different ways that the coronavirus response is potentially impacting family violence. Again, understand the need for the actions to help slow the pandemic. But real concern when we close schools, libraries, and churches, families depend on them so much. They're such a critical part of the routine. And now when we take that away, we've got potentially children maybe being watched by individuals they're not normally supervised by. You've got children being at home way more than they normally are. We're thinking about bars and restaurants closing. Again, we're talking about the idea of unemployment, potentially of caregivers. We also know that one of my studies revealed that highest risk perps are those who abuse or are domestic violence abusers and abuse pets. So they harm humans and animals as a very high risk perp. That 74% of them abuse alcohol and or have a mental illness. Unfortunately, the way the data was collected, not by me, but those things were grouped together. But we do know a high percentage of these high-risk perps have alcohol addiction issues. Now, if the bars are closed, where are they going to be drinking? Probably in the home where the children are as well. With the idea of social distancing, that's a common tactic by domestic violence abusers. Now it's likely to be compounded even further. We know that these layoffs and you just go in the grocery store and can see limited resources that are even available right now. Again, likely to compound stress and risk factors for abuse, kind of like the diagram I showed earlier. And then this idea to self-quarantine. We do know that victims of domestic violence often wait for the abuser to leave to make the call to 911. Well, now they may not have the opportunity to do so. Right, the abuser may not be leaving. They may just literally be trapped in these homes with the abuser for an extended period of time. I do know that even already here in America, just as the quarantine has just recently kind of really started, we're already seeing, I'm having agencies report to me an increase in domestic violence. Child abuse, I think I have information on that on the next slide. I would expect the increase in child abuse, unfortunately, to be more likely to come after all of this is over, when the children return to school, which again is why this is so important right now, that we think about these things and we act on them, because these children right now are trapped in the home. And if no one from the outside is seeing them, how scary and concerning of an environment is that? Here's an article from out of Texas that from Cook Children's, just describing that unfortunately already they've seen a spike in severe physical child abuse cases, and that's my fear, that the cases that are extremely severe and significant in terms of the point of physical injury, where the child is near death or is taken to the hospital. We may know those reports, but I'm so worried about these significant emotionally harming and psychologically harming events, where we're talking about children just trapped in the home with a perpetrator, where they are constantly victimized for the next 4 weeks or however long this quarantine continues. And then by the time they return to school, what kind of state are they going to be in? That's why it's so important that we have to figure out ways to work together, to work better together, to get to these children. It's not good enough for me. I'm not hearing many action plans out there from government, from community leaders in terms of not in the field of family violence, about what we're doing or how we're acknowledging these families. Again, I understand the pandemic response. I think we need to at least acknowledge, though, the risk that is increasing in these homes. And what is our plan? It can't just be, let's wait until the smoke clears and dust settles and see how everyone did. We need more than that right now. And again, this is what I speak to when I talk about out of an unnamed Indiana county. I know the name, but not disclosing that. I'm looking at substantiated reports of child abuse or neglect, and you see that spike in August after kids have been out of school for 2 months, then they return to the school system, and it's not uncommon to see that bump. And that's what I'm worried about here, that once the quarantine concludes, kids return to school, and we see that skyrocketing of reports to child services. When the virus does pass, or the greatest threat does pass, and we return to quote unquote normal life, whatever that looks like, my concern is that family violence professionals will be completely buried in cases at that time. And so again, I think it speaks to the need now to figure this out. How can we work better together? How can we get to these homes more quickly, and maybe find new ways of doing that better? The clock truly is ticking. It really is. Every minute, every day, it matters. And I think that's why I really am feeling a little frantic, just in my fear and concern for these kids. I talked about my own hurt and pain. It's what I channeled to help drive this work. And unfortunately, all of my internal alarms are going off now. Children are at an extreme risk, as well as their caregivers, as well as pets in these homes right now. Right now. And I feel like it gets worse as the stress compounds and as each day that goes by. And so I'm just feeling the need, just to speak that how important it is that we figure this out, and not soon, but now, that we're doing everything we can. We have to know that as family violence victim serving professionals, we did all we could, that we did everything. We didn't leave a single stone unturned. We explored partnerships. We set aside differences. We did everything we could to make a difference right now. We need to know that when we flip this, when this concludes and quote unquote life returns to normal. We know that in China, they're already reporting that during their quarantine, they saw a tripling of domestic violence reports. And I fear we're going to see something similar, or maybe even worse here, after this is passed. So we're going to be talking about traditional partners too, obviously, but as they say, desperate times call for, well, we can't really say desperate measures, even if that's how we feel. Not extremely reassuring to the public, but I'll go with desperate times call for innovation. It's time to explore potentially new partnerships right now, partnerships that really probably could have and should have been in place even before all this. But now, again, as we think about our limitations, particularly during this quarantine, and how difficult it is to potentially reach these children and families now, we need to be thinking about who may still have contact with them during this quarantine. That's what I'm going to talk about a little bit now, and then we'll get into more of the traditional partners when we think about community alliances regarding domestic violence and family violence victim serving agencies. this thinking outside the box and engaging new community partners isn't necessarily anything new. As you see the article there about engaging the community of hairstylists, again, thinking, just of additional resources in our community, additional people to bring into this fight. As I said, our resources are already so slim. It makes sense to try to figure out new ways and new perspectives and new people we can bring in. A library is another big one. As I said, that's why it's so damaging that they're closed now, that they're being closed. And again, I understand the response, but many families talk about these libraries as being critical. Many of these, quote unquote, at-risk families, finding these libraries absolutely critical of where they go. I've got a quote here from the article you see there below. Just jump into here. One day before we got to the library, Miss Sue was walking down the street on her lunch break. She greeted us. "Hello, how are you? Will we see you in the library later today?" Listen to this. This is what this really, it's really sad to think about this perspective. She talked to us as if we were any other family that goes to the library. How sad is that mindset? That it even has to be said, that it was so rare that she made us feel like everyone else. The mother smiled, continuing, "That conversation was a turning point in my life. I began to think of myself in a more optimistic and confident way. In time, I was able to get out of a troubled marriage and move into an apartment with my children." If you're not working with hairstylists, not working with libraries, again, unfortunately, they're both largely shut down right now. But when all of this passes, again, new community partners. We can do no harm in engaging more and in teaching more and educating more about what to look for, what to see, and who to call if you see it. So again, if you're not working with those partners, I encourage you to do so. When we're able to and they resume operation again. Now I'm going to talk through some of the more traditional disciplines when we think of domestic violence response. Again, many of the ones that I mentioned before, I think should be things we start thinking about and talking to agencies we start engaging. But I'm going to talk about some more of the traditional ones when we think about responding to domestic violence. Unfortunately, there are some that I've had to leave out just to try to keep this as close to an hour webinar as I can. I am going to be doing a series of webinars, and I'll get to some of those other agencies in that time. It's again not that the ones that I've cut or left out are it's not that they don't have important roles. Again, my talk kind of evolved as current events have evolved, and so I want to make sure that I'm sharing up to the date current information based on where things are now relating to the coronavirus response, and then also things hopefully that you can take away from after the quarantine concludes and things kind of go back to, again, normal, whatever that looks like. But we're going to start with law enforcement. When we think about law enforcement responding to domestic violence, we think high risk. It's something not to be taken lightly. I hear officers talk about feeling like they're walking on eggshells when they're responding to these incidents, that they're fearing for their own safety, often not even understanding or not even fully knowing what's going on when you pull up to an incident and you're not for sure where the perpetrator is, if they're on scene, if they're about to come back. It's just something not to be taken for granted. We know that they are putting their lives on the line every day, but especially when they respond to these incidents. 20% of domestic violence homicide victims are not the partner of the perpetrator. They can be family members, neighbors, bystanders, and then responders. And unfortunately, here you see a list of a series of officers killed when responding to domestic violence incidents. We know that risk is high, so it's something that I always want to acknowledge. A lot of my data and the information I use in my studies and my publications and in my presentations comes from law enforcement. And I always want to make sure that I do not take that for granted, the risk that comes with collecting that data. It is an area I want to focus on. It is an area I want to focus on as well in terms of a benefit that law enforcement definitely brings, is this opportunity for data. And we don't often see police data reported in studies and published literature for whatever reason in domestic violence. It was a gap I noticed early when I was trying to figure out how I wanted to attempt to advance the field, and so it's kind of where I've spent a lot of my time, is utilizing police data sources to report on domestic violence. I think it provides a great perspective, and it could be a key resource even now during this quarantine. Law enforcement often has data that is unique because it's often collected from the scene right after the incident is reported, as opposed to retrospective anonymous surveys where victims may forget information. there are a lot of things that can go on as that clock ticks. But law enforcement often is on the scene right after the call, and you have a good opportunity to get good information in the moment. And I just see a lot of value in that. And again, that's why I base a lot of my research and in my writing and my presentations on data collected there from these scenes. The study you see there is a study I published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence, where I analyzed nearly 10,000 domestic violence reports and observations from law enforcement officers. And additional information that and value that came from using this police data was some new information that hadn't necessarily been reported in literature yet. On average, couples with IPV history have had how many prior unreported incidents? So by the time the incident is reported to police, law enforcement is responding, how many violent incidents have already occurred? 10, unfortunately. And many of these couples in my studies were in their first 2 months of their relationship, which is extremely concerning, obviously, as we're looking at an average of potentially 5 violent incidents per month. We hear agencies often saying that they feel like they're behind the 8 ball from the start in working with these families. This may speak to that. Right, we've already had 10 incidents before we ever get that first call. We're already seeing a pattern of violence in the home. Children in the home have already been exposed 10 times. Doesn't make it impossible, it just makes it extremely difficult. And again, it's trying to figure out how can we get into these homes sooner. That 10 number is terrifying to me. How can we get there before they've already been victimized 10 times? And again, thinking about risk for law enforcement. So if there's already been 10 incidents, right, there's already this pattern of violence in the home. Again, speaks to how officers are at high risk when they respond as well. I want to just speak briefly then on the difference between reports and incidents. As I said, China already reporting in their media a tripling of reports to police of domestic violence, and that's significant. When we talk about a report, and when I think of a report, rather than just saying a victim as we often call it, I really think of it being more accurately described as a household, because the whole home's impacted. So when we think about a domestic violence report, we don't have a victim, although we call it that in our reports. I understand that, but when I'm thinking of it from looking at its impact on the community, what we really have is a household. So when we have one report, one household, we know only 1 in 4 will ever actually report to law enforcement. So every time you get that one report, you're really looking at 4 households. Now each household, each report, again, we're looking at 10 incidents occurring before that report. So when you're talking about a tripling of reports, you are talking about a significant increase in incidents. an alarming increase in incidents during the quarantine. And again, what I'm afraid we're likely experiencing right now across America. And again, speaks to just how alarmed I am for these families right now. And in my opinion, the violence that is likely occurring all over the country. Another area of value when we look at using law enforcement data to report on domestic violence is that we get a day and time stamp. When we're looking at retrospective anonymous surveys, a victim may or may not remember the date, time. When we're talking about police reports, we've got a day, time, day of the week, all of those things. And so my study was one of the first to actually publish and look at domestic violence in terms of when it's reported to law enforcement by day of the week. The day that it was most commonly reported was on a Sunday, as you can see there. Sundays were number one in reports, with Saturdays to follow. I've looked at it in multiple states since then. As I said, my study that I'm referencing was based in Indiana. But looking at Michigan, Virginia, Oklahoma, seeing very similar trends there as well, with Sunday often being the day where incidents are most reported. Now, often when I speak about this in front of a live crowd, I'll have someone ask me, well, is that Saturday night spilling into Sunday? No, it's not. It's actually Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening. Perpetrators often say things like, it's the only day of the week where the children, myself, and my partner were all in the house together. No one's at work or school. The children were going crazy from the whole weekend and just boiling over. I was extremely stressed thinking about Monday. Again, when we think of those things, and again, think of our current state being in the state of quarantine and the high stress that is occurring all over the country. Again, many of these families are literally living weeks full of Sundays right now. So we know Sunday as being the highest day for reports. We know why they're reported. Literally, the circumstances are mirrored every day of the week for these families right now as that Sunday as it's described. And again, I think speaks to my reason for being extremely concerned about what's going on behind the walls of many of these homes right now across America. And when we look at one study I wanted to focus on, I think is of particular interest in the Journal of IPV, looked at a survey of churchgoers and church leadership. In 2005, they asked these questions and followed up with the same questions 10 years later, just to get an idea of how things are changing and evolving. A very fascinating study. I thought extremely interesting. One of the things that I took away is that both in 2005 and in 2015, I think in 2015 the number rose to about 80% of churchgoers said they would really want counseling from their pastor if victimized by violence, that they would prefer to speak with their pastor and receive that guidance. Concerningly, and again, not much, actually this time not much of a change in the 10 years, church leaders wanted to help their congregation, but they did not feel that they could do so. In fact, only 20% felt comfortable. So here you have 80% of the church, or of churchgoers in the survey, saying that if I was impacted by family violence, I would want my pastor to help me. You have 20% of pastors saying they could do so, 80% saying they wouldn't feel comfortable. So again, a real opportunity here, I think, to engage these church members, and I mean, it's so hard for them, for anyone, victims of family violence to report it. Here we have a group saying, if this were in place, I would probably report it. It just seems like a real opportunity there to potentially reach these victims more quickly. Again, looking at another map, I use maps often in my research. I try to do a lot of spatial analysis. I try to be very careful with this one. You'll see it's a little blurry and it's pulled back. That's intentional. Obviously, I can zoom it in, but I'm trying to protect identities and locations and things the best I can to not reveal anything. I want all the information I share to be helpful, never to put anyone at risk. But my point of sharing this is this cluster here. This is all the violent sexual offenders registered in Marion County at the time I developed this image. You see this cluster here. There are churches located, and one in particular right here, where if you were to take a circle around the church property, 1 mile diameter circle, so extended beyond the church property, but 1 mile diameter, there are 208 registered sexually violent offenders living within that circle, literally surrounding the church. Unfortunately, we hear abusers do at times target members of church congregations, hoping that they will find kind of an open door there. The idea that what they've done in the past is forgiven and forgotten. Unfortunately, abusers don't play by the rules, and we do see them preying upon victims in churches. And again, it's something that is just another angle and something that's important to note. If churches aren't equipped or aren't even thinking about watching for offenders in their congregation, it's something that absolutely can be happening. And unfortunately, from personal experience in working with some churches and other family violence, I know of several instances where it was happening in similar areas. And a couple quotes, just based on some of the things we've talked about already, but this is from a victim of domestic violence. I'm more likely to seek help from my faith community with domestic violence than I am the police. So again, victims very much want to speak to faith-based organizations, their pastor, the church, if victimized. And then this is from a church. We focus now more carefully on staff interactions with children and families. And they kind of reference this idea of a lot of the media attention based on abuse in the church, which again I think can be scary. Obviously, we want to make sure that children are not and anyone is not being obviously harmed in the church by church staff, church volunteers. We want to do those background checks. That's important. But I think sometimes it can blind us to this whole other side and other piece of the church members being at risk from someone else. So even though we're protecting them more or we're better protecting them from church staff, are we doing everything we can to help them or protect them from those outside of the church or those who venture into the church to harm them? Again, I'm thinking of a case where I actually shared this information with a pastor. He said, I was reluctant to hear that and to even think about my congregation having individuals that might be targeting my churchgoers. But I still shared it with my staff. Said, if there's anything that concerns you, I've never really even thought about our staff or someone targeting someone in our church, but I shared that with them. And I have to tell you that there was just this one instance where there were several members of the staff that felt concerned. There was a single mother with a couple of young children and someone that we didn't really know well from outside the church we later found was a registered violent offender. Which in itself doesn't necessarily mean that they were going to do anything. But we went to the mother. We said, hey, in love, we're just sharing with you. We have some concerns just in watching interactions. I remember even from the pulpit being distracted by it, watching what seemed to be kind of inappropriate contact by this individual to the mother during the service. And I remember voicing something to her, my concern. She was very upset. She didn't want to talk to me about it. She seemed very mad. But then a few days later, she came back to me, said, I've had concerns as well. Something doesn't feel right. Something feels off. As she pursued a little further, she said, I really feel that there was something inappropriate going on in terms of targeting my children. As a result, I've ended that relationship. And the pastor said, I really feel like that message and knowing that information and doing what we did saved those children from potentially being abused by that perpetrator. So there are stories out there, and I've heard them personally, of taking greater attention and making this a priority, not just of protecting victims from church staff and volunteers, but from victims out there in the community and helping them. There's great opportunity here to make a real difference and impact. Again, speaking to opportunity from a study, domestic violence homicide victims, 30% of the study were affiliated with a church, most often a churchgoer, not necessarily church staff, but 18% of the perpetrators also affiliated with a church. So again, great opportunity. Unfortunately, these are again in domestic violence homicides, where you still see a high proportion of both victims and perpetrators entering and being a part of a church. Again, opportunity to reach and try to reduce domestic violence. For my own survey, as I've been doing, conducting surveys of multiple disciplines and issues related to many of the things we've described. I surveyed 100 and I surveyed a lot more than that, but I heard back from 132 church leaders from 43 different states, as you see in blue, multiple denominations and various church sizes. I will probably ultimately eventually turn this into a study, but I'm writing 4 others right now. It was a 10-question survey I developed that a quote that I think is important to consider, again, with a lot of implications, particularly what we're looking at now with the quarantine. Church on Sunday was the only time he would let me out of the house, talking about a domestic abuser, violence abuser. I suppose he wanted everyone to think everything was good in our home and that he was a good person. This may be particularly true in rural environments, as they say here, rural communities. We do hear victims say who are in a kind of a lockdown scenario where they're not allowed to leave the home, their communication is severely limited. The perpetrator still allows them to go to church. And again, I think it's part of the image type of thing. But what an opportunity. It literally may be the only opportunity to reach that victim when they're in that church. And again, we just see churches having critical opportunities to make such a difference in this field and in this fight to end domestic violence. So when we think about child protective services, child protective social services, again, we see a very important role. Right now, during the course of this quarantine, your hands are I mean, your opportunities are severely restricted. You know, schools are important community partners, so are libraries. Again, you're an agency that I would really recommend looking at it, reaching out to some of those other community partners, some of those that aren't necessarily traditional in what we think about, but as I said, time to kind of think about doing that possibly right now. When I think about child protective services and domestic violence, I'm thinking about increased risk. In fact, children living in a home where domestic violence occurs are at 60 times the risk of abuse or neglect. 60 times, just knowing domestic violence occurs in the home. I mean, what a significant risk. Really spikes the risk for children in these homes. And most of those studies, when we talk about the 60 times, look at physical, sexual abuse. They don't even account for emotional abuse. You know, which I would say is extremely high. You know, probably even higher than that. Important to note, these are some kind of important takeaways from speaking with case managers and child services staff, both strong suits in some communities and others where maybe it didn't seem like it was as high up as it should be in the list of priorities, but just the importance of knowing that children in those early years are at such high risk of long term. We're talking about children, you know, they're born with a brain that is so dependent on their caregivers to provide safe and a safe environment conducive for growth, so that, you know, as we're born, our brains are not fully developed and we're dependent on that environment to allow us to reach our full potential. Unfortunately, so many of these children inside of the age of 2 in particular that are in these domestically violent homes, they don't receive that safe environment, and their brain shows it. Unfortunately, we see long-term, at times irreversible damage. Doesn't mean there's no hope that we still can't work with these children, we still can't create good outcomes. It just means literally in those early years, it is a one shot deal with many of our body organs and development and things of that nature. And it is so critical that we are aware of that, and that we are vigilant about all cases, but even more so about these young children who may not even be able to describe or speak to tell us what's wrong or what's hurting. Just knowing the high risk there, even more so than physical or sexual, but including those as well, but of that psychological or emotional harm. And again, the idea that I talked about earlier, we really can't separate the well-being of a child from their caregiver. We have to be helping both if we want to help either. And we have to remember that these are pairs, these are teams. I often include the pets in that team as well. Children and the adults are often so dependent on animals in these homes that I do view them as a team. And we really can't separate the well-being of any of them if we want to help any of them again. When I talk to Child Protective Services workers across the country, this is the thing they bring up probably more than anything: the idea of invisible injury. Right? This, bruises fade, fractures heal. Emotional harm from abuse can last a lifetime. They see it, they know it, but they find it very difficult to prove. Um, in terms of in the courtroom, to judges, to the court systems, and I get that it's a resource and something I'm exploring right now. Something that child services workers ask over and over again: a breakdown by age of greatest risk emotionally. I just making it something simple that they can use. It's something I'm creating and developing now, and hope to have soon. It's just so eye-opening, though. I think I always find this graphic to be particularly concerning but enlightening, of a 3-year-old child of a normal brain there on the left and a brain exposed to extreme neglect on the right. No known physical or sexual abuse. This is just not receiving the conducive environment or environment conducive to growth they need. And you see the extensive differences there from the normal brain to the 3-year-old who did not receive the attention and care they needed. Again, as I said, these emotional injuries will set them back and put them at further disadvantage and create changes to their brains and body organs that may not be reversible. Sometimes the way that looks, again from a real example, one night the perpetrator hurt mom and then he left. Mom came crying up to my room. Again, child not harmed. Child may or may not have been in the room, but think about how emotionally harming that is, to know that happened and then the mom coming up to them crying. I was always worried about my mom. I thought she was going to get hurt. So now we see it going on beyond that night where the child is continually worried, reliving this incident, thinking about it continually, being harmed by it further. Finally, we see I felt unsafe, scared all the time. I didn't sleep. I used to sleep at school. So here we go again, a child feeling safe at school, and that's why they're falling asleep in the classroom because they don't feel safe sleeping at home. Quite distressing, actually, because I knew that if we stayed in that environment, we would all die. So you see just how it goes from this one incident where the child doesn't even necessarily see the incident occur, and just the significant emotional harm and psychological trauma that they're exposed to, and that they are continue to be exposed to. And again, as I said, for me personally, just emotional harm, and here I am 22 years later still struggling with it. I'm working through it, I'm healing, but it still is a problem for me. And we see that for many of these kids. It's something emotional damage, emotional harm, toxic stress, without effective intervention, and without often a lot of time. They may never fully recover from it, and it is absolutely why we have to take these things more seriously and find ways to better protect these homes and these families. Okay, here's the break slide, as I said. Take this break, stop thinking about all the heavy and difficult things we're talking about. And just allow yourself mentally to take a moment's rest, and we'll jump back in. So one of the things that I've been doing, it's been a little while now. Obviously, I'm not traveling at all right now. I should have been speaking in 6 or 7 different states in the last couple of weeks, all of which were canceled related to the obviously flight and travel restrictions right now, and then also contact restrictions. Which is why I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you through this method. I've been itching to get out there. I really, it's a difficult message, obviously, but one that I appreciate each and every opportunity to share and feel privileged in getting to speak on these things. But one of the things I've done when I've traveled to the DC area and visited the, I think it's called the National Gallery, which really is a surprise. In high school, I actually got a D in art, and have retained probably even less than that to today. So really very little talent art-wise, but for some reason I found enjoyment in walking around the National Gallery. One of the things that and I think I'm saying that correctly, I think it's the National Gallery. One of the things I've been doing is trying to rename some of the artwork, though. The paintings are tremendous. Obviously, I wouldn't even bother to try to do anything like that. I have no talent whatsoever. Maybe the painting the wall there behind the portrait might be something I could do, but even that I'm not so sure about. But one area that I've tried to help is in naming these paintings, because I think sometimes the paintings are tremendous, and the names just kind of fall short. So here we see, this is called Lamb's Nantucket, 1874. I've actually renamed this Target for Birds. I thought that was kind of a much more appropriate name and kind of better suited the artwork there. This one, called The Tragic Actor, Rovere as Hamlet. Again, great work, great painting, just missing it there with the title. This is something I'm very familiar with, a pose I've seen many times. I actually call this leg day. At Planet Fitness, I've seen many individuals set their weights down and walk over to the mirror and kind of take a look in the mirror there. This is pretty extreme for this guy. He's actually literally set down his sword so he could grasp his cloak and kind of pull it up, to get a look there at his leg and thigh possibly. But again, something I would have called probably leg day. This one here we see titled The Skater, Portrait of William Grant. Excellent work of art, just lacking there in the name. I would have called this Fine, I'll Skate, but you can't make me like it. Again, as I said, a father of three children, and then being a child once myself, I'm familiar with that pose and how that works. Here we have an old woman dozing over a book. This was easy for me to name, actually. As I said, I'm just about to obtain another degree. I would call this graduate school. I mean, that's a pose that I've mimicked and mirrored myself many times, unfortunately, over the last several years. And finally, we have the red schoolhouse. I kind of want the story here. I mean, it seems a slam. You've you've painted this woman here, and then you have the school here, and you name it Red Schoolhouse. So I don't know if this was someone, maybe an ex-girlfriend that, or something that the painter broke up with, and then went with that. I don't know what. I don't even want to get into that. I'm not sure. It's not really any of my concern, I guess. I'm just naming the painting. So what I would call this is, again, an expression that I was more familiar with before all of this started, but particularly in my youth of thinking, when you're missing the start of the Indianapolis Colts game because Sunday sermon went long, and your parents won't stop talking in the parking lot. Again, a facial expression and just a real feeling and vibe from that painting that I can absolutely relate to. Next, we're going to talk about animal control officers and veterinarians. Unfortunately, entities that we don't often see well utilized in multidisciplinary family violence prevention teams and intervention teams and strategies, but one that, and a group that absolutely deserves a seat at the table. Absolutely. We need to be including them more. Unfortunately, many communities, it may not, or at least be a limited option. As you can see in southern Indiana here, the state's colored in there, or the county's colored in there, my understanding, do not have formal animal control now. And again, we think of the large region there with no active animal control, which will be even more concerning as we move on through this presentation as I speak to their importance of having these agencies. In fact, around 30% of Indiana's counties do not currently have an animal control agency. Again, alarming. We're really missing a good opportunity there. Again, not just to protect animals, but protect their humans as well, as we often see violence interconnected and intertwining in these homes. When we think about animal abuse and how it relates to family violence, we're concerned about the violence to the animals, obviously. We also know it indicates an increasing risk for humans in these homes as well, where incidents, both in severity and frequency, will often increase over time. And we know with each incident, for humans and animals alike, there is a shared risk of harm. We talked earlier about how domestic violence victims will experience 10 incidents and then they'll call 911 on average. Unfortunately, when the suspect also has a history of abusing pets, so DV suspect who harms pets too, victims will wait till they've experienced 20 to 50. So we already talked about being behind the 8 ball when the victim has experienced 10. Now they're experiencing 20 or 50 violent incidents before we get the first call. I mean, you talk about a trend and a pattern of violence already so well on its way. It's just so difficult to turn that. Not that we can't, it's just extremely difficult. Higher risk for responders, absolutely. Again, we were worried when we've got a pattern of 10 and a responder arrives on scene. How about now 20 to 50 violent incidents? Of course, high risk for responders. So, when I don't know if we'll get into it in this talk or if it'll be in a different talk that I'll add later to this channel. But if I were an officer responding to domestic violence incidents, one of the first questions I would ask regards or even searching data on the home as I'm responding through their systems. Is there a history of animal abuse too? I want to know that right away, because I know if I'm responding to DV and there's that history of animal abuse, my risk is through the roof. I want to come home safely to my family. At the end of the day, I want to protect obviously the family the incident I'm responding to, the family involved there. I want to know that right away. Right away. That's one of the things I want to know. It absolutely indicates a higher risk. It's my belief too that this may be why we see these IPV homicides involving suspects where they don't necessarily have a formal record or history of prior reports. Again, the victim may have reported it at incident 25, 30, 40. They just unfortunately were killed in incident 8, right, and just didn't have the opportunity to get to that point of where they might do so. So looking specifically, when I talk about an increased risk, what am I talking about? So specifically looking at domestic violence and looking at characteristics in homes. On the left, you'll see a home with no history of animal abuse. On the right, a history of animal abuse. So just seeing how that spikes the risk. So again, IPV suspect, no history of animal abuse. We've got 8% of these victims, and this is from my recent study, my follow-up study, the study I showed earlier in the Journal of IPV. Any of the studies I've mentioned or shared today that I've written, or any of the work that I've done, if you contact me through my email, which will appear at the end of this presentation, I would be glad to send that to you. History of forced sex or rape, 8%. When we just know one thing, we know the IPV suspect also has harmed animals. That rate jumps to 26%, so more than triples. Strangulation, 47%. And again, this was in Indianapolis in my study. National average and estimates were closer to 30%. So even just not even having the animal abuse piece, that number was already high. We add in pet abuse, 76%. We were talking about a very high strangulation rate, just knowing that the domestic violence abuser also harms animals. We look at some more of like the toxic stress, emotional abuse side of things. Controls the daily activity. Victims report things like, they can't really do anything without the perpetrator's permission, that they control their every movement essentially. 55% of the time, no history of animal abuse. Add in animal abuse, 84% of the time, the suspect controls the victim's daily activity. Victim thinks the suspect will kill them, and again, we think of the significant emotional trauma of that. 35%, just in general, jumps to 78%. Nearly 80% of the time, the victim believes they will be killed. And again, imagine living with that daily fear, and just the damaging emotional effects of that. Now, these suspects that data suggests present the highest risk for these families, how do they appear on scene to officers? Officers most commonly report them as calm, apologetic, and crying. So important to remember that we don't know what's behind that surface, just below the surface. So I think it's a note I always wanted to make, because when officers, many of the times these perpetrators are gone, they're not on scene. When they are on scene, they will often present themselves this way to the officer. The natural human response when you see someone doing this is to kind of take a breath, to relax, but we can't afford to do that. The data suggests the risk is off the charts. If you know they harm humans and animals, your own life is probably even more in jeopardy than it is normally. There's always risk with DV, we know that. And they may appear this way. It does not mean that the risk is not still there. Just something that it's important to be mindful of. When we look further at these suspects again, so suspects that are domestic violence perpetrators and also harm animals. And again, when we're thinking about the times we're living now in this quarantine and how difficult it is to reach these families, these perpetrators in particular, we are extremely concerned about these homes right now. They know the children won't be returning to school for an extended period of time, and many of them may view that as an opportunity. I am very concerned by these homes. Here are some of the reasons why. Suspects in these homes, 74%, as I said earlier today, of these suspects abuse substances and/or have a history of mental illness. 40% of them have threatened or attempted suicide. 84% of them control the victims' daily lives, as we said. 68%, nearly 70%, have a gun. So again, you're talking about a very high number of them abusing substances likely to be on them, as we see in data when you're responding to these incidents. Having a history of mental illness, having threatened suicide, and probably having a gun. So again, when I talk about high risk to officers, to first responders, it's probably even higher right now in the state of quarantine with the heightened stress. And we're seeing things like panic gun buying and things like that as gun sales go up too. I would be extremely concerned about risk now. So again, we're talking about engaging community partnerships and those pieces, but we also want to be mindful of that risk, that there really is high risk for responders as well. And so when we talk about reporting, we want to do it as safely as possible. When we're talking about reporters and responders responding, absolutely aware of the heightened risk probably for you as well right now. When we look a little further at data, because I do think this animal piece is very important to these issues and often does not get talked about enough. Looking at some more data here in Indianapolis, where I'm located. Unfortunately, we're seeing an increasing report of animal abuse or neglect. You can see some slight stair-stepping there, but overall a pretty consistent increase. Interestingly, we see some pretty significant overlap in seasonality, with pet abuse almost mirroring domestic violence or IPV rates in my community in terms of when they're most commonly reported. So we do see some overlap. Further, when we look at them spatially, um, we see domestic violence there in Marion County on the left, and now you're looking at animal incidents on the right. Again, we see significant overlap. There's so much value in using animal control data. And we think about now, again, we are seeing some increase in domestic violence reports during the quarantine, but many of these reports, may not be coming in. Again, if the victim is trapped with the perpetrator, cannot escape them because of the self-quarantine measures, they're not going to call right now. Animal calls still may be coming in. We'll get to that later. So we may still be getting this data right now, and it is so important we're utilizing it. So if you are not working with animal control right now in your community, you need to be, and not just during this quarantine, but on after it as well. I'm seeing yet another Indiana community, this in northern or in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then looking at the animal incidents again, seeing some significant overlap. And I want to clarify, these are not just population maps. Even controlling and looking at population. Yes, we see obviously more incidents occur where more people are, just by doing the numbers, just thinking about it logically. Obviously, there's greater opportunity there, but we're not just looking at clear population maps. We do see a lot of overlap. Again, I'm trying to protect people's identities. Many of these incidents are in fact occurring not only in the same area but in the same home. But in an attempt to try to, I don't want to further jeopardize victims in my maps. I just am using them to show that there is spatial overlap in these incidents as well. And then also in Boone County, Indiana, with domestic violence on the left, animal incidents on the right. Again, we may not be getting these calls right now during the quarantine, and many other times we may not. Every call is an opportunity. If we know animals are at risk, their people likely are too. We need to be utilizing this animal control data and really taking advantage of potential opportunity to protect humans in those homes as well. When I said right now limitations of the quarantine are probably drastically, even though we may be seeing a report in domestic violence, there may be many that don't come in because many of these domestic violence reports come from the victim themselves, and there's a lot of barriers to calling right now, even more so than normal. 90% of animal control calls, however, come from a neighbor. So neighbors don't share these same restrictions and barriers that victims are facing. Neighbors are more likely to be in their home right now and not leaving. Neighbors may still be calling about pets. It's getting nicer where I live here in Indianapolis. I don't know what the weather's like where you're at, but particularly if the kids are going crazy, the animals are going crazy, everyone's trapped in the home, animals may be even more likely to be outside, and that may be our best chance at spotting abuse in the home right now. A concerned neighbor seeing a pet who appears abused or neglected and calling it into animal control. Please take each and every animal control report seriously always, but particularly right now, it literally may be our best shot at getting into these homes right now. Further speaking of the importance of animal control, looking in Boone County, Indiana, the excellent work of the Boone County Sheriff's Department and Deputy Fisher and her work there. As you see in 2016 and 17, a low number of animal-related incident calls in Boone County, Indiana. In January 1st, 2018, they made it a priority to respond to these incidents, set up animal control, and alerted the community that they were going to be responding to these incidents, that how to report it, things like that. Look at the dramatic increase there. I think it just speaks to really, whether it's domestic violence, animal abuse, pet abuse, child abuse, whatever it is, when we make that effort in the community to just kind of, even in some communities where maybe nothing necessarily has changed, but just as a refresher, like this is a priority for us. We are going to respond to these things. Please tell us. We want to know if you see something, say something. Look at the dramatic impact that can have. And again, when we look at it spatially, look at each of these dots represents an opportunity, not just to protect an animal, but the family as well. Just so critical, and I just want to highlight the importance of the great work that's being done there in Boone County, again with Deputy Fisher and the Boone County Sheriff's Department. If you're not aware of Deputy Fisher's organization too, that she is president of, HALO, HALO, out of Indiana. Again, it's Hoosier Animal Law Officers. Such a tremendous, just great work being done by that organization all across our state. Just really a unique idea, and I think a tremendous idea of uniting all of the animal control officers across the state of Indiana and providing them with resources, assistance, and just all kinds of help and assisting in communication and team building there. And really something to look at just as a great example. So again, that's HALO, HALO. Moving now to the school system, and just thinking about, again, the critical role that that the schools play in this fight to end domestic violence and family violence. Again, hands kind of tied right now. I know a lot of school staff and teachers and administrators are feeling very concerned right now, because children that they were worried about, now are kind of out of sight for an indefinite period of time for as long as this quarantine extends, which obviously is extremely concerning for them now. One of the things that's important when we think about the schools, just the disastrous burden that is still exists in our country that is just not being accurately or efficiently addressed. While nearly 4 million children in the U.S. struggle with a diagnosable mental disorder, less than 20% will ever receive those mental health services they need. Just staggering to think about the number of children who are suffering mentally and emotionally, many of whom have pasts and histories like what we've described here today, in homes where domestic violence and child abuse occur. Thinking about many of these children then who have that need, we think about in the home. Here's a quote from a domestic violence survivor. "I'm not quite sure how they coped, really. I was obviously not in the right place myself. I was not emotionally and physically in the right frame of mind. I couldn't support them." Again, not that the mother didn't want to be there for them. We see this so often the case with these victims, that they simply have nothing left to give. They've had so much taken. It's not that they don't want to help their children or be there for them. They simply have nothing left to give. And these are the families that are in such desperate need of help. We're not talking about necessarily taking children away, as opposed to providing services and assistance and protection from the abuser, who, for many of these abusers, it's almost a game to see how much pain and harm they can inflict, what they can get away with, and still maintain appearances so that others may discredit the story or feel it not to be the case. Again, just this awful game, and for the victims, it's not a game, it's life. And we think about just what's so unfairly taken from them, that often they just have nothing left to give. So then we end up with these children that are in such desperate need of help, and many of them find it from the school, from their teachers. Sorry, just thinking about what it really has me upset, thinking right now about what's going on in American homes right now. I can't state that enough. It's alarming to me, and it may sound like an extreme point of view, but I don't believe it to be at all. And I think we'll hear increased reports, unfortunately, because we're going to try to help children, and we're going to do our best to get as many as we can, but we won't be able to get them all. And I'm almost even more concerned about the ones we won't ever hear, and the potential harm there that's being done. I mean, these kids often have nowhere to go. They look to school for safety. Some of them sleep during class, not because they've been up all night playing video games, but because, I'm thinking of one child in particular who slept with his German Shepherd because his dad told him that if you, one of these days you're going to wake up and your dog's going to be gone, I'm going to kill it. And so he slept with his dog every night in his bed and couldn't sleep because the dog was so big, and then he would fall asleep in the classroom. And we see children finding solace and comfort in their teachers and in relationships at school, and just thinking about them losing this right now. Again, I understand the necessary precautions relating to the pandemic, but these kids are at super high risk now in the home, trapped with the abuser, and without these individuals that they've likely so strongly depended upon to help them cope with what was happening in the home. Unfortunately, we do see some of these children impacted by domestic violence acting out in the classroom. We see problem behaviors often being common with, many of these children describe or experience either high or low stress response. For me, I talked about my own toxic stress response. It was is an over response, where my stress response, what would normally be just a slight bump for some, where your blood pressure would rise, your heart rate would increase. For me, it's through the roof. It would just go through the roof to the point where I had trouble even speaking. I can think of even remembering undergraduate college classes where I would literally couldn't breathe just to introduce myself. The fear and the stress would create such a response that I couldn't even speak. I won't necessarily say that that's gone now. It was present for it's really been the last 3 years that I presented quite a bit. I spoke 47 times at conferences last year alone, in over 20 different states, and it's still a struggle. But for me, there's something about speaking on these issues it makes it not about me, and it allows me to speak. My fear of speaking still remains great, but the fear of what happens if we stop speaking out for these victims remains greater. And I would encourage you to do the same, to use whatever you've got, whatever voice you have, whatever you can, to speak out for these children and for these families. Now more than ever, they need to hear that. They need to know that. One of the things that stuck with me about reading Chinese media reports about responses from victims during the quarantine over there was that they at least the adults mentioned finding help, or finding some sort of solace and comfort in seeing public messaging about it, so that others were at least sharing on social media the heightened risk during this time. It helped them to know that people were thinking about it at least. I actually took out several ads on Facebook to try to get this message out there, simply with a message of increasing risk during this time of quarantine, and Facebook takes them down, unfortunately, as soon as I put them up, and says that I'm not allowed to post about social issues that could influence the election, and not allowed to talk about a quarantine or child abuse or anything like that, which was a little disheartening. But I do know that it's important to these victims, and so even sharing it on social media, doing whatever you can to get this message out there, not necessarily this webinar or my message, but your message in terms of just of reducing risk in these homes, is so important. We see these children acting out in attention-seeking ways. Again, not shocking if they're not getting the attention they need or deserve at home, looking for it elsewhere. We unfortunately see these children being both bullies and victimized by bullying. We can see inconsistent grades, again, based on what's going on in the home. Sometimes parenting schedules can affect that too. I've heard from school staff and personnel, just the idea that if a child's with dad, we know the grades are going to look this way. If they're with mom, we know they're going to look this way. So being aware of some of those things, particularly when it's an emotionally abusive or physically abusive environment. One interesting study out of 2010, as you see mentioned there, really looked at how children impacted by domestic violence affect really the entire classroom. Children from troubled families in the study significantly decreased the reading and math scores of the entire class. And these students also increased misbehavior in the classroom. This kind of hits home for me. In high school, I actually had a teacher pull me out once. Again, as I said, I tried to be a class clown. I was often laughing in class, in school. I even with close friends, I let some of them know some things, but it was only my dog that really saw me and where I was, and just like I said, very dark days, many days where again I just wanted it to be over with, and I contemplated things like that. But I remember a teacher pulling me out and saying, you literally brought down the GPA of the entire class. I had transferred into a different school. I wish you'd never come to this school. And so, I look back and, there's regret in that, in terms of knowing that I did affect other people's grades. But I do see confirmation of this study from myself personally, of knowing that I was actually told that I did exactly what this study would suggest that, someone from that type of scenario and situation would do. Speaking of domestic violence, shelters now, and just the importance here. Again, it can be very difficult for victims or survivors to even make it to shelter. There's so many barriers and reasons for not doing so. We hear victims describe, well, when my money's right, or when I have enough money, maybe I'll leave, but until then I'm going to remain. And again, thinking now during the quarantine of how likely they are impacted by this, and maybe they were about to leave or going to leave, and now they're literally trapped in the home with these perpetrators, which again just spikes the risk and is extremely concerning. So when we think domestic violence shelters, the victims now, or survivors, have made it to safety. So now what? What's next? It's a big step for them to get out of the home and to get to the shelter. What next? Well, we need to be thinking about who they left behind. Thinking specifically of a victim who told me, our beagle was like family to us, particularly for my young son. And the shelter we were going to could not accept pets. Had no options there for them. I actually remained in my home for several years, longer than I should have, because I didn't want to leave that dog behind, because my abuser had said if I leave, he would kill my dog, and I knew he was telling the truth. And unfortunately, we see that in literature. If an abuser threatens harm of an animal, they almost always carry it out. And more often than not, if there's a child in the home, they will carry it out intentionally in front of the children, a very high percentage of the time. Again, thinking about using these acts of abuse to inflict as much harm in the home as possible. So we need to be thinking about who they left behind. In this case, the woman described having to leave this dog behind. She's made it to safety. Her words, I should be able to focus now on me, on my family, on healing, and I can't. I can't stop thinking about that dog I left behind. And so she ended up actually sneaking back out of the shelter one night, and unfortunately, the abuser had kept his word and had killed the dog, and it was laying in the yard. And it just obviously became something that kind of sent her into a downward spiral, unfortunately. So we need to be thinking about who do they leave behind. Hopefully no one. When we think about domestic violence shelters, at the very least, we need to be offering fostering options for pets. Best option, we're protecting the pets there too. These pets are critical to their family. They are a member of the family. They have suffered with the family. They have stood with the family, and they deserve to be protected with the family as well. And I think it's so important that that we acknowledge that, and that we're doing all we can to make that a reality. We need to be thinking about potential barriers to continued separation. One of the first things and important things that shelter should be talking about with victims individually is a plan of what's going to keep you from what's going to push you out of here, or what's going to keep you from healing. Identifying some of those things. Are there financial problems? Are there family problems? Are there, what is most likely to be a barrier to keeping you apart from this perpetrator? Children, and identifying and at least starting there can be a good starting place when working with these victims and survivors. Thinking about who they're sharing space with in the shelter, particularly if it's a shared setting, and being concerned about other harmful behaviors, self-medication, and making sure that there's potential for healthy relationships. Many of these victims are hurting and are very uncertain times as they're just leaving a relationship. We want to make sure that they have access to healthy and positive modeling of behaviors and relationships, and aren't potentially being further traumatized by others who are also, in similar circumstances to them now too. When we think of other opportunities while in the shelter, thinking about parent-child interactions, thinking myself of an example of seeing a woman and a young child who the child appropriately for age was messing with the mother's cell phone or asking to play with it or something along those lines. And the mother just kind of snapped. I remember witnessing that and just really losing it on the child. And so this idea of modeling what are appropriate parent-child interactions. A lot of these pairs really need to be shown and taught that. They may never have experienced appropriate behavior toward them in their life. And so it's so important that we're modeling those behaviors to them so they even know how to expect, or how to act and how to expect in terms of what they should be acting, what their expectations are of how others will act to them, is what I'm trying to say there. When we think about child behavior, again, for age, what's appropriate expectations for a child developmentally, and what should parents be asking and thinking of them. We see victims in these homes, children, often being asked to do things much that they shouldn't be doing for their age, and being asked to be really older in many ways than they are. And so trying to fix some of that and show what's appropriately appropriate behavior for age. Obviously providing counseling and looking at breaking some of the cycles that many of these families have seen or experienced for so long. Developing and strengthening their support systems, making sure that there's something in place there, whether it's through a church or whether it's through a community or through family or friends or those who are going to support their health and recovery and healing. Making sure education, employment, and other basic needs are met. We have to meet these needs first if we're going to expect them to stick with the plan and to really move forward with their lives. We have to make sure that they're able to do so and that they have these necessary provisions. Again, thinking about relieving stress and trying to get them to a place where they can focus on mentally healing and beginning to work through some of these things. As I said, absolutely critical. Thinking of an international survey where 90% or so of victims surveyed said, when asked, what is one thing that would help in terms of making it easier for you to go to shelter, and they said protect our pets. And I hear it over and over again from victims, please protect our pets. at the very least, a foster program. Again, we see victims being hesitant to go to shelter because they have to leave their animal behind, and I don't blame them. I don't think I would want to leave mine behind. It's not an animal, it's a family member, and that's what many Americans view their pets to be. When we do a foster program, the animal and family, unfortunately, are still separated, which the animal's not going to understand, and children aren't either, especially not if they're in a home impacted by domestic violence and they struggle with trust and stability and some of those things that the pets may be providing. Being separated from the animal can be extremely traumatic. And so if this is the way you have to go, at least allow there to be some sort of communication so the child is reassured that the pet is in fact okay. Families and pets in the same shelter really is the best way, because then the family can still see the pet and the pet can still see the family, and they're both very important to each other, and they've been through so much together and they need to stay together. We from recent numbers, I believe it was through a Red Rover study, or Red Rover that released the information that they had discovered that 17% of U.S. shelters now, this is up from recent years, now, and thanks largely to work of Red Rover and other organizations such as them, now 17% of U.S. shelters do shelter pets with their family there on shelter site. And I think it was around 6% of Canadian shelters that do as well. So still plenty of room for growth and improvement. It really should be all shelters, but at the very least, be working toward a foster program if you're not already doing that. There are barriers. As we do anything, I want to acknowledge, I know there are difficulties, allergies, other things come into play. Abusers don't play by the rules. They'll come forward and claim the pet as theirs. The pets have been abused, so they can be difficult to foster, difficult to shelter. And sometimes we do see victims leaving the pets behind in the shelter. But again, Red Rover sheltering pets and families together, or families and pets together. Organizations that I would recommend reaching out to. The Animal Welfare Institute also has good information. They can help you address some of these barriers, because this truly is something that is a major barrier for victims. They will not come to shelter if you do not protect their pets, and it makes sense. Like I said, I don't blame them. Unfortunately, I kind of took for granted that there were shelters everywhere now, domestic violence shelters, and that's not the case here. In my home state of Indiana, there are still 39 counties who have no domestic violence shelter. And these counties will say, well, the victim can go to the shelter nearby or near them. But again, transportation often a major issue for victims. And you think of those red areas and there being no shelter. Again, it speaks to the need for churches in these communities, especially if there's no shelter for them to go to. Chances are there may at least be a church in their proximity that might be doable, as opposed to trying to leave and travel, in some cases as many as 20, 30, or 40 miles. Again, it's so hard for victims to leave and to seek shelter. We know that 1 in 4, just looking at women, not even counting all the men and children and animals impacted, 1 in 4 women will be impacted by significant physical abuse in a relationship. Again, we're talking about a huge proportion of the population, and really concerning when I see these huge clusters of red, and you think of a victim potentially living somewhere like here, and the great distance and the great barrier there to even get out into an area that does have a shelter. Okay, we're going to quickly look at some effective prevention ID and intervention programs that exist from a multidisciplinary standpoint. And then I'm going to just quickly review some of the points we've made today, and end with a quick call to action. One of the programs I want to highlight is the Baker One Project, a law enforcement project out of Charlotte and Mecklenburg, North Carolina area. This project was a combined effort between law enforcement and I believe prosecutors or court systems there in the community, of a zero tolerance policy to domestic violence. They have dedicated officers to respond to domestic violence incidents. They had a hotline set up where victims could call in 24 hours a day, even if it was non-emergent. No one would necessarily answer the phone for a non-emergency, after hours, but it would be recorded, and so that someone could hear it. Just a good way to make sure victims continued to feel that they were being heard. And the result of this was a 98.9% decrease in 7 target locations of reoccurrence of events. So just extremely effective. Data collection, another huge component and identifying the high-risk offenders and doing things like that, like I've talked about earlier. So an interesting project, and one that it's unclear how much it is still in effect. A lot of times we see programs when there's a change of leadership or a change of funding that unfortunately get cut even when they show promise. But definitely a lot of promise shown in this one based on the independent study that was done to analyze. The Divert program in Colorado Springs, another great program that is a multidisciplinary panel that reviews each case in the community of domestic violence and assigns it a certain level based on a variety of factors where they determine risk. Again, we're concerned about all of these cases, but sometimes resources are so limited it necessitates decision making, and sometimes that's best done using data to determine at least giving us a means of identifying potentially the highest immediate risk of harm. This program encouraged weekly contact with each victim, with a phone even being provided to victims if needed to make sure that they could contact them. Outcomes included reduced violence for the victims, for the children in the home as well. We saw perpetrators being less likely to reoffend, and stronger relationships across disciplines. Again, working together to the common goal, all coming to the table, reviewing cases together, making decisions together, and just really a strong example of community inclusion and of working well together from a multidisciplinary standpoint. And then hearing from multiple victims that this program saved their life, and just obviously the value, you can't put a price tag on there of seeing these victims and survivors literally credit these efforts to saving their life. Another program that I think is an excellent one to think about is Mia Escuelita in San Diego. And I believe they have another school as well, maybe a couple more that have opened now. This is a therapeutic preschool designed specifically for children from homes impacted by domestic violence. All of the staff is trained in trauma-informed care, and really just a great model for working with these kids. Interestingly, an independent study by the University of San Diego found that children from this school performed as good or better than their peers in many key academic areas. And again, as we talked about earlier, there are many reasons why there are barriers for children from these homes, and just what a testament to the effects of working and dedicated effort on working with these children and the positive outcomes that can result from them. An example here of a shelter, again, as I talked about the importance of allowing pets. This is from a shelter in Pennsylvania, and I believe Red Rover was involved in this project, and if I remember right, the Eagle Scouts from the community donated the materials and time to build the shelter there for animals at the domestic violence shelter. And again, it may look small, may look, well, it's just a couple animals. For the families that are now able to bring those pets, it's everything, and just such an important thing that shelters begin to look at and explore and continue to do. So some of the key takeaways from today, particularly when we think about the information I provided in light of the quarantine and the current state of affairs in our country right now. Law enforcement, you're at a high risk when responding to these incidents. We need to appreciate that when we're working with them. But we know that victims even now in the state of quarantine are at even probably higher risk. So your risk is probably even higher during the extent of this quarantine, not just from a health standpoint, but from physical harm or even death when responding. So it's very important that we're aware that there are great barriers to calling right now. If a victim is doing so, they're likely overcoming those barriers, but there is likely a high risk, even higher than normal. Law enforcement data, again, is critical and something that you can be using if you're not currently utilizing it to explore patterns and potential opportunities even now to identify high risk areas of your own community. Animal control, just knowing that the shared overlap there, you may be the best chance right now during this quarantine for family violence reports. A neighbor spotting an abused dog, calling it in. We need to be taking all of their calls extremely seriously all the time, but especially right now. It may be our best opportunity to identify human victims in these homes as well. Child Protective Services, again, hands tied right now in some ways with some of your typical community partners, so it's time to explore new ones. And again, not to replace the old ones, but to strengthen your response even when the quarantine concludes. So again, thinking about some of those new community partners that I suggested at the beginning. The school systems, check in with your students and families to the best of your ability. I know many of you feel helpless right now during the quarantine, but finding ways to check in with those families and maintain contact, and if at all possible. I know some teachers will do readings over the internet that seem to be extremely effective in drawing the attention of children and ensuring that they have a positive contact there. Really a great way to check in if you have the resources or ability to do that. I would definitely recommend it. Churches, check on your families. Please do so. Again, there are many families in your congregation impacted by domestic violence. You may not see it. You may not realize it. Statistically speaking, it's happening. So check in on your families. Stress is high right now. Ask them how they're doing. Try to get a feel for that. And maybe even consider in your ongoing messages. Many churches are still meeting online, potentially addressing the high stress right now from that perspective and the importance and risks that could be occurring right now. Medical teams, which we didn't necessarily talk about today, just for the sake of time, knowing that they're on high alert right now for in the response to the virus and the response to that, but still being aware of potentially seeing many high-risk families, knowing that you're likely to see families who are sick and maybe have high stress, and there could be some potential for seeing still victims in the emergency room and things like that, even not related to symptoms of the virus, but just reporting to the emergency room, whether it be from cases of severe physical child abuse or of domestic violence. So being aware of injuries that are often indicators of non-accidental trauma and being sure that you're reporting those to the proper authorities. And then shelters, especially during this time, if you're not already fostering pets, again, trying to eliminate that barrier, figuring out some way in the community to engage animal welfare community or animal welfare agencies, or in some way to at least foster pets and remove that barrier for victims from fleeing the home. And making sure that, especially during this time of quarantine, that survivors know you're still open, that you're still a safe place. They may be obviously experiencing even greater barriers to leaving. Transportation may be even more of an issue now, and so thinking of those things and looking obviously to the community to step up and to provide resources and to provide materials and potentially even utilizing local media to get that message out there, that even if you're not seeing your increase in cases yet, you're very likely to do so. The same for Child Protective Services. Even if you're not seeing that bump, you probably should be expecting it. We don't want it to happen, but we need to be expecting it and planning for it. So even now, beginning to think about putting some of those resources in play so they're ready when you need. Finally, the final thought I want to share, again, just as I said, my heart is breaking for the families in these homes. It always is. It's that passion for these victims that drives my work. But right now, I am especially on high alert. Again, I think back to my own emotional state and my own emotional harm. I just believe this lie that I was of no account, that I had no value, and that I had no worth, that my life was to be a sacrifice. There are so many children across the country and around the globe believing that message right now. They are hearing it so strongly. They are trapped without their teacher, without their librarian, without their person who makes them feel special, their person who helps them get through. They do not have that right now, and they are trapped in a lie, and they are hearing it, whether it's through acts of abuse and neglect or through the spoken word or through all of that. They are hearing it and they are feeling it, and it breaks my heart, and we have to find ways to get to them. They are so worth it. One of the things that was a struggle for me is I never wanted to be a dad. I was always afraid that I would harm my own children. That was just a huge fear of mine, and another lie that I believed, that I couldn't be a good dad, that it wouldn't be possible for me to do that. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Sorry, that takes my breath away a little bit. My precious daughter that was just here recently born, and just the joy my children are to me. These kids are so worth it. They are so worth it, and we have to figure this out. I implore you now, if you have a voice, use it. Whatever means necessary, whatever means that you have at your disposal, we need to be sounding the alarm right now for the increased risk for these families. Again, as I said, when this all passes and it clears, we have to know we did everything we could, because the risk is off the charts right now. It's not an overreaction, it's not an overstatement, it's real. When I talk to child welfare agencies around the country right now, many of them are sick to their stomach, they are concerned, they are very worried. As I said, at the very least, if you have a voice, use it. Reach out to your local community leaders, local agencies, local media, whoever will listen, and just inform them of this increased risk. Make sure they're on the same page. Again, I understand the response to the pandemic is necessary, but it's just as necessary that we're thinking about these families too. Again, just the idea of let's wait and see how things play out is not good enough. We need to be developing coordinated community efforts, thinking about the things I've talked about today, going to other agencies in your community and figuring out how we can work better together, engaging new community partners. Again, I implore you, these children are worth it. They are so worth it. And so I encourage you to leave it all out there and put it all on the table. And it truly is a time to give everything we've got to try to get to these families and to protect them, you know, hopefully before the abuse occurs, but at the very least to be there to help them and mitigate the harmful effects of witnessing just often unspeakable trauma. So again, I thank you for your time and attention today. Here are some of the references I'll include in the next few slides of that I pulled. For most of my studies I get over 100, and I think today's talk I utilized about 162 studies and books, the full list which I could send to you if you have need of them. Just some more references here. I just included these first few pages, but as I said, well over 100, I believe in 60 something that were included in today's talk. And finally, here's my name and contact info. I'm sitting on just a gold mine of data right now, so I try to keep what I can without exposing or putting anyone at risk on social media there. And then also you're viewing this video on my new YouTube channel. This is the first of several videos to come. I'll be doing multiple trainings related on issues involving family violence during the course of this quarantine time when we're all stuck in our homes anyway, and then on beyond too. So I hope the talk was helpful. Please feel free to send me an email if you have any questions. Please be mindful, I will respond. I'm way behind. Last year I spoke 41 times and on average got about 15 questions per talk. So I'm looking at 800 something questions, and I take them each one seriously and I work through each of them, but I'm way behind. So it will take me a minute. I do try to respond almost instantly or very quickly if a victim or survivor is reaching out for help. But other questions that I appreciate very much, they just may take me some time. So I appreciate your patience, and I just appreciate your attention and the opportunity to speak with you through this webinar. Thank you.